At the will reading, my brother got everything. The house on Maple Creek Road that my grandmother had lived in for 43 years, the savings account, the land out back, almost 2 acres of it, the jewelry my mother had been eyeing since I was 12, all of it. Every single thing my grandmother had spent a lifetime building, slid across a mahogany conference table and handed it to my brother in a manila folder. And I sat there, hands in my lap, saying nothing. Because what was I supposed to say? I was the one who drove her to chemotherapy every Thursday for 8 months. I was the one who learned how to refill her insulin pump because her hands had gotten too shaky to do it herself. I was the one who sat on the edge of her bed on a Tuesday night in February and listened to her talk about my grandfather who had been gone for 11 years, like he just stepped out to get the mail. I did all of that, and I got nothing. But here's what my brother didn't know. Here's what none of them knew. The lawyer hadn't closed his folder yet. He looked up, cleared his throat, and said, "There is one more document." My brother's face changed before the lawyer had even finished the sentence. And in about 60 minutes, you're going to understand exactly why. But first, let me take you back to the beginning, because this story didn't start at that conference table. It started a long, long time before that. My name is Nora. I'm 32 years old. I live in Vancouver now, have for the past 5 years, and I work a job that pays me well enough that I don't have to think about money every single day the way I used to when I was younger. That part matters. Remember it. I grew up in a small town in Ohio called Millbrook. Population just under 8,000, the kind of place where everybody knows what car your family drives and approximately how much your parents paid for it. My grandmother, Grandma Ruth, had lived in Millbrook her entire life. Same house, same street, same rose bushes out front that she replanted every spring, even after her knees started going. There were 2 of us, me and my brother, Daniel. Daniel is 3 years younger than me. He's 29, he's funny, he's charming, he has the kind of smile that makes you forget, momentarily, that he borrowed $200 from you 7 months ago and has never once brought it up. Growing up, Daniel was the easy one, that's what my parents said. Not in a cruel way, just as fact, like describing the weather. Daniel's the easy one, Nora's the complicated one. I wasn't complicated. I was just the one who noticed things. I noticed when my dad's paycheck didn't stretch to the end of the month and my mom stopped buying orange juice and started buying the powdered stuff. I noticed when Daniel's school shoes were new and mine had been re-glued at the toe. I noticed when my grandmother slipped an extra 20 into my coat pocket at Christmas and whispered, "Don't tell your mother." Grandma Ruth noticed things too. That's why she and I understood each other. When I was 23, I got a job offer that took me to Toronto first, then eventually Vancouver. It wasn't glamorous, it was just a good opportunity. The kind you say yes to, even when your stomach hurts. I packed 2 suitcases, hugged my grandmother in her kitchen for longer than felt normal, and got on a plane. Every week after that, I called her. Every single week. Sometimes twice. We talked about the neighbors, the garden, old movies she'd been rewatching. My grandfather, Earl, who she missed in the specific, practical way of someone who has lost their person, he would have fixed that gutter by now. Earl always fixed things before the first frost. I visited when I could, twice a year when my schedule allowed, once a year when it didn't. I always stayed at her house, never a hotel. I'd sleep in the same small bedroom I'd slept in as a kid, under a quilt she'd made herself, with the radiator that clicked all night like a metronome. Daniel lived 40 minutes from Millbrook. He visited Grandma Ruth maybe 4 times in 5 years. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because it becomes important later. When Grandma Ruth was diagnosed, I was in the middle of a project at work that I couldn't just walk away from. She called me herself to tell me, her voice steady, matter of fact, the way she approached most things. "Nora, I've got something going on with my pancreas. Nothing to cry over yet. I just wanted you to hear it from me." I cried anyway, after we hung up. I flew to Millbrook the following weekend. I sat with her doctors, I read every pamphlet they gave us. I asked the questions that nobody else was asking. What does this mean in 6 months? What does this mean in a year? What do we need to set up so she can stay at home for as long as possible? My parents were there too. And Daniel. Everyone was very concerned for about 3 weeks. Then, gradually, it became mine to carry. My mom had her own health problems, her back, her anxiety, a dozen reasons that were real, but also conveniently timed. My dad worked long hours. Daniel had a new girlfriend, then an apartment, then a job change, then another reason, and another. I rearranged my life. I took every other Thursday off and flew back to Millbrook. My company was understanding, more understanding than I deserved, probably. I used every hour of PTO I'd saved for 2 years. I paid for a home nurse on the weeks I couldn't be there out of my own pocket. $900 a month that nobody offered to split, and that I didn't ask anyone to split because asking felt like making it about me. Over 8 months, I spent just under $7,000 on her care. Flights, the nurse, medications her insurance didn't cover, a hospital-grade bed rail I ordered online at 11 at night because she told me she felt unsteady getting up. $7,000. Nobody asked. Nobody offered. Nobody said, "Nora, let us chip in." And I want to be clear, I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because I loved her. Because when I was 8 years old and my parents were fighting so loudly I could hear it from my bedroom, it was Grandma Ruth who picked up the phone. Because she was the one person in my family who had never once made me feel like a burden. I did it because it was the right thing to do. But I'd be lying if I said it didn't cost me something. Not just money, sleep, focus, a promotion I probably would have gotten if I'd been in the office every other Thursday instead of sitting in a hospital waiting room in Ohio reading the same magazine 3 times. Those are the numbers. I want you to hold them. Grandma Ruth passed in October, early on a Thursday morning. The home nurse called me. I was already awake. The funeral was small, the way she'd wanted it. A few hymns, a few people from the church she'd attended for 40 years. Her rose bushes cut and arranged on the altar because she'd once told me she thought funeral flowers from a shop looked sad. Daniel gave a eulogy. It was nice, genuinely. He spoke about her cooking, about how she always kept hard candy in her cardigan pocket. He made people laugh, which she would have liked. He cried at the end, which was real. I didn't speak. I had written something, 3 pages in a notebook on the flight over, but when the moment came, I couldn't do it without falling apart. And falling apart in public was something I'd spent 32 years learning not to do. So I sat in the front pew and held my mother's hand and said nothing. 3 weeks later, we were called to the office of a man named Gerald Marsh, estate attorney. 3rd floor of a building on Millbrook's Main Street that also housed an insurance company and a dentist. The conference room was small, dark wood table, framed diplomas on the wall, a window that looked out onto the parking lot. There was a box of tissues on the table, which I thought was a kind touch, and also a little ominous. My parents sat on one side. Daniel sat next to my father. I sat across from them. Gerald Marsh opened his folder. He read the will in the measured, unhurried way of a man who has done this many times and understands that pacing matters. Grandma Ruth's estate, he explained, consisted of the house on Maple Creek Road, appraised at $280,000, the savings account, $64,000, the land behind the property, surveyed at 1.8 acres, appraised separately at $112,000, personal property and jewelry, a small life insurance payout. Total estate value, somewhere in the range of $500,000. I watched Gerald Marsh's eyes move down the page. He looked up. The estate, he said, is to be transferred in its entirety to Daniel James Calloway. My brother exhaled. My mother put her hand over her mouth. My father nodded slowly, like this confirmed something he'd suspected. Daniel looked at me. I looked back at him. I didn't say anything. I didn't flinch. I just sat there with my hands folded on the table and felt something very quiet move through me. Not rage, not grief, something colder and more specific. The math. $7,000 in care costs, 2 years of weekly phone calls, every Thursday. The hospital bed rail I ordered at 11 at night. The nurse I paid for on 9 months of solo. The promotion I delayed. The flights, the hours. And now, nothing. I picked up my water glass and took a sip. Gerald Marsh was still looking at his folder. And this is the moment. This is exactly where I need to pause. Because what happened next, what Gerald Marsh said in the next 30 seconds, is the thing that changed everything. For me, for Daniel, for my entire family. But before I tell you, I want to ask something. If this story is hitting something real for you, if you've ever been the one who showed up, who paid, who carried, and still ended up with nothing, hit subscribe right now, because I share stories like this every single week, and the people who need the most are the ones who almost never look for them. Hit subscribe and then come back. Because what the lawyer said next, my brother did not see coming, and neither, honestly, did I. Gerald Marsh closed the main document. He paused. He reached back into his folder, and the sound of that, just the soft rustle of paper, felt like the temperature in the room dropped 2 degrees. He placed a second envelope on the table. It was cream-colored, sealed. My name, Nora Elizabeth Calloway, was written on the front in my grandmother's handwriting. The handwriting she used when things mattered, the careful, deliberate script she saved for birthday cards and important letters. Your grandmother, Gerald Marsh said, looking at me, asked that this be opened after the primary reading. She prepared it 18 months ago and had it witnessed and notarized at this office. It is a legally binding addendum to her estate. My mother made a sound. Daniel went very still. Gerald Marsh slid the envelope across the table to me. I looked at my name and her handwriting for a moment. Then I opened it. Inside was a letter, 4 pages, her handwriting throughout, and behind the letter a separate legal document, 2 pages, formal, notarized, that Gerald Marsh had clearly already reviewed because he waited patiently while I read it with the calm of someone who already knew what it said. I'm going to tell you what was in that letter, but first I need to tell you what was in the legal document, because that came first, practically, legally, and because it is the reason my brother's face looked the way it did for the rest of that afternoon. The legal document was a transfer of land title. Grandma Ruth had separated the land, the 1.8 acres behind the house, from the rest of the estate. 18 months earlier, quietly, without telling anyone. She had retitled it, with Gerald Marsh's help, as a direct transfer to me upon her death, bypassing the main will entirely. The land appraised at $112,000, but that wasn't the reason Daniel went pale. The reason Daniel went pale was what Gerald Marsh explained next. The house, the $280,000 house that had just been transferred to my brother, shared a driveway and utility easement with that land. The only legal access to the road ran through the parcel my grandmother had just given to me, which meant my brother now owned a house with no legal road access. Without my cooperation, without my signature on an easement agreement, the property could not be sold, mortgaged, or developed in any meaningful way. Daniel owned a house. I owned the only way in or out. Nobody said anything for a very long time. I read the letter twice in that conference room, and once more that night in the hotel room I'd booked downtown. I'm not going to read you every word. That belongs to me. But I want to tell you what she said, because it matters to this story and because it matters to me. She started with an apology. She said she knew I would think she was leaving me nothing, and that she was sorry for the minutes, however many minutes it is, Nora, before you open this, that I might spend believing that. She said she had watched me for 32 years. She said she saw me in a way she wasn't sure anyone else in the family had managed. She used the word quietly several times. You have always done things quietly. You have always given quietly. You have always hurt quietly. And then she wrote, I did not want you to spend one more day being quiet about what you deserve. She explained the land. She said the land had been her father's, my great-grandfather's, and that before Earl died, they had talked about who it should go to. She said Earl had said, without hesitating, Earl, it goes to Nora. She said she had waited until she was sure. 18 months ago, when I had flown in for a Thursday chemo appointment and brought her soup in a thermos, because she'd mentioned 2 weeks earlier that the hospital cafeteria soup tasted like nothing, when I had done that, she had known. That was the week I called Gerald, she wrote. That was the week I made sure. She ended the letter with one line that I have not read aloud until right now. She wrote, You were never the complicated one, sweetheart. You were just the one who paid attention. We didn't speak in the conference room after I finished reading. Daniel asked Gerald Marsh very quietly if this could be contested. Gerald Marsh explained that the transfer had been executed 18 months prior, properly witnessed and notarized at a time when Grandma Ruth was, and he chose the word carefully, unambiguously competent. He said it with the measured neutrality of a man who had answered this question before and expected to answer it again. Your sister, he said, looking at Daniel, holds title to the land. Any questions about road access and easements would need to be negotiated directly with her. Daniel looked at me. I looked at him. I didn't feel angry. That surprised me, honestly. I had expected anger. I had expected satisfaction, even. The sharp, specific satisfaction of a score finally settled. But what I actually felt sitting in that small conference room on the 3rd floor above a parking lot in Millbrook, Ohio, was something quieter than any of that. I felt like my grandmother was in the room. I drove back to Vancouver 4 days later. In that time, Daniel called me twice, my mother called me 3 times, my father sent an email, which he never does, with the subject line, Can we talk about the property situation? I didn't respond to any of them immediately. Not out of cruelty, out of clarity. I needed to think. I needed to decide who I wanted to be in this. Not who I was being forced to be, who I was choosing to be. That's a distinction that took me a long time to learn. On day 6, back in Vancouver, I called a real estate attorney of my own. I explained the situation. She confirmed everything Gerald Marsh had said. She also told me my options, clearly and without drama. I could grant the easement immediately, full access, no conditions, just let it go. I could negotiate, tie the easement to a fair payment that reflected, even partially, the $7,000 I'd spent on care or the costs I'd absorbed over 2 years. Or I could simply wait. Do nothing. Let the situation sit until someone came to me with a genuine conversation. I chose option 3. I decided to wait. Let me ask you something, and I genuinely want to know. Drop it in the comments. What would you have done? Would you have granted the easement and let it go? Negotiated? Or would you have waited? Because the answer I got from people when I asked that question, the answers surprised me. The calls escalated. My mother called 9 times in 2 weeks. Her tone moved through every stage I recognized from childhood. Concern, then persuasion, then guilt, then something that wasn't quite accusation but was standing right next to it. Daniel didn't have children. He had a girlfriend, but I took her meaning. Nora, your grandmother wouldn't have wanted this. I thought about that one for a long time, and then I thought about the letter, and the soup in the thermos, and the Tuesday in February when she'd talked about Earl like he'd stepped out to get the mail. And I thought, actually, I think she wanted exactly this. My father's email was 3 paragraphs. Practical. He outlined the impact on property value, the difficulty of securing a mortgage, the timeline pressures. He didn't mention me once. Not my contribution to her care, not my flights, not the $7,000. He treated the situation like a logistical problem that I was somehow failing to solve. I wrote back one sentence. Dad, I'm happy to talk about this when we've also talked about the last 2 years. He didn't reply. And then something happened that I didn't engineer and didn't expect. My grandmother's closest friend, a woman named Carol, who had known our family for 40 years and who had been at the funeral in the 3rd row, called Daniel. She had heard through the particular telephone network of small towns that there had been a second envelope, that there was a land dispute, that Nora, the one who had been flying in every other Thursday, had been given something separate. Carol, apparently, had a lot to say about that. She told Daniel that she had watched me at those Thursday appointments, that she had been at the cancer center herself, her husband, 2 years prior, and that she had seen me in that waiting room more times than she could count, reading, eating vending machine crackers, waiting. She told Daniel that in 40 years of friendship, Grandma Ruth had never once mentioned his name in relation to those Thursdays. She had mentioned mine, every time. Daniel called me after that conversation. Different tone, quieter. The charm was still there, it's structural at this point, like load-bearing walls, but underneath it something had shifted. He asked if we could meet when he was next in Vancouver. I said yes. We met at a coffee shop 6 weeks later. We talked for 2 hours. I'm not going to give you every word of it because some of it belongs to us, and some of it was painful in the specific, private way that only siblings can be painful with each other. But I'll tell you the important parts. He said he didn't know about the Thursdays, about the nurse, about the $7,000, about how many times I had rearranged my life in the last 2 years. I believed him. Not completely, he's not an unobservant person, but enough. Enough to think that maybe what had happened between us wasn't malice. Maybe it was just the particular cruelty of a family that had sorted us into roles so early, so thoroughly, that no one had ever thought to question them. He was the easy one. I was the complicated one. He got the grace. I got the responsibility. And both of us had just lived inside that sorting for so long that neither of us had stopped to ask, who decided this? And when did we agree? I told him I wasn't interested in using the land as a weapon. I also told him I was not interested in pretending that the last 2 years hadn't happened the way they had happened. We agreed to work with our respective attorneys on a fair easement agreement, something that reflected a contribution, not a payment, not a settlement, just an acknowledgement, a number that meant, I see what it cost. He agreed. My mother, when she found out the terms, called it unnecessary. I thought about telling her how much a one-way flight to Millbrook costs on a Thursday morning. I didn't. Some conversations, I've learned, are not worth having with people who are not yet capable of hearing them. That was 8 months ago. The easement is signed, the attorneys are done. Daniel has his house with road access. I have a parcel of land in Millbrook, Ohio, that I have visited once since the will reading, on a cold morning in March, alone, just to stand on it. It's not much to look at, mostly grass, a few old trees along the far edge, a slight slope toward the back. But it was my great-grandfather's, and then my grandmother's, and she looked at it for 43 years from her kitchen window and decided somewhere in the last chapter of her life that it should come to me. I stood there for about 20 minutes, and then I got back in my rental car and drove to the airport. I've been in therapy for 4 months, not because of the will, because of the 32 years before the will, the ones that made the will feel somehow like both a surprise and the most predictable thing that had ever happened to me. My therapist talks about something she calls invisible labor, The work that doesn't get recorded anywhere. The flights and the phone calls and the Thursday waiting rooms and the soup in the thermos. The work that doesn't show up on a ledger because nobody is keeping one. I had been doing invisible labor my entire life. For my family, for employers, for relationships. I had been performing reliability and generosity so consistently, so quietly, that I had somehow convinced myself that the performance was the point, that the doing enough, even when the doing went unseen. My grandmother saw it. She had been watching for 32 years, and when she couldn't say it while she was alive, not loudly enough, not clearly enough, and not in a way the room would hear, she made sure to say it after. She put it in writing. She had it notarized. She gave me the way in. I want to ask you something before we close. Has anyone ever been that person for you? The one who noticed when no one else did? The one who said quietly or loudly or legally, "I see what this cost you, and I want you to know it mattered." And if you're in a season where nobody has been that person yet, where you're still carrying things quietly, still showing up for people who haven't noticed, still waiting to be seen, I want you to hear this. You don't have to keep making yourself small to fit into a family that wasn't built to hold all of you. Invisible labor is still labor. Invisible love is still love. But you deserve to be visible. You deserve a room where someone notices when you're gone. Maybe you're living a version of this story. Maybe your second envelope hasn't arrived yet. Maybe you're the one still sitting across the table waiting for the lawyer to reach back into the folder. If you are, I want you to know. Someone is watching. Someone is keeping a record. And sometimes, the people who love us most make sure we get what we're owed, even when they have to do it from the other side of a very quiet October morning. Drop "I saw it" in the comments if this story meant something to you. And if you want more stories like this, about family, about money, about the quiet cost of being the responsible one, subscribe. I'll be here every week. I'll see you in the next one.